All right. So, welcome everyone to the Glorious Both and podcast, where we dive into the often overlooked shadows and dangers of self negating non duality and Neo-Advaita, also exploring ways to recover from damaging effects, and most importantly, exploring humanistic alternatives. So, today I'm here with a very special guest, JB Jordan, not sure which one you prefer, Bates. And JB or Jordan, what do you prefer?
Either way, Jordan Bates, is how it's easiest to find me. Yeah.
Awesome. Jordan Bates. And Jordan is a fellow life explorer who I met on Substack, which is a blog platform that's really engaging and has like a notes section where people are pretty engaged in commenting on people's posts and generating like pretty deep, constructive conversation. And he is the author of 5 books. He's also a dad, a musician, a rap artist, which is cool. Maybe we can put together some rhymes about the dangers of Neo-Advaita. Can't say I haven't tried that myself already. And also, he's a men's coach. That's one of the things that he does predominantly for his occupation. So we might get into that a bit later. But I'm really grateful that he's here. And one of the main reasons why we're here to talk with all of you is because him and I have both been writing as well as doing video content and speaking about the often sort of hidden at the onset dangers, pitfalls, and dark sides and shadows of modern self-negating non-duality, Neo-Advaita, radical non-duality that all kind of share some common themes of either negating or radically undermining the personal sense of self, the reality of the world. A lot of other sort of doctrines might be that you're familiar with is there's no doer, there's no agency, there's no meaning, no purpose, etc. So, uh, yes, we're both spreading awareness about the dark side, which is super important. One, just for balance, because if you've been around the block with these teachings, sort of in the same vein as a lot of like enlightenment rhetoric, is this sort of uh, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Coming back. Right. So these teachings and pathways are pretty ubiquitously like glorified as panaceas, as the only way to be free from suffering, as the only truth. And a lot of the benefits, you'll hear things like, unshakable peace and freedom from all suffering and a life of ease and effortlessness and, the most exquisite form of bliss and joy and untouchability is really the way that they're often described, and some might say as sort of like dangled carrots. But the glaring sort of blind spot is that the real downsides and adverse effects that are pretty common, of course, not for everyone, but pretty common and more people are talking about, are rarely disclosed in a consistent way. They're not presented sort of upfront. So a lot of people in great moments of suffering are very drawn to these sort of quick fix notions of, just kind of get rid of the one who's suffering. And then a lot of people find themselves sort of in over their heads in something that's like radically changed their lives and in some ways been very damaging, and really wish that they had heard upfront from people who've been down those paths and can come back and say in like, in a nuanced way, like I think you and I are doing, that yes, there are things that you could gain from these pathways, but there's also really dark sort of shadow sides to it that make it extremely reasonable for people to not want to pursue these paths and for people to want to get off of them when they've realized that they're not serving them anymore. And so yes, that's reason number one. But the other thing that really draws me to JB and what you're sharing is your perspective that you've kind of described as sort of many modes of perceiving reality, and how one of the kind of stages that you've gotten to is kind of getting past this whole kind of dogma of, no self, for example, or perceiving reality, sort of with a sense of there's no doer here, for example, that this is the ultimate truth. This is revealing to you the one and only way that reality actually is. This is sort of the best mode to always be in. No other mode can sort of touch this or is valid. And you're kind of now saying like, well, wait a minute, no, there's many different modes of perception that we can, let's say, toggle between if we want to, and that there is a real sort of danger and sort of dogmatic layer to preaching that there's only one mode of perception. But what I really am excited about with this conversation is that it can, I really believe, can help people in like a really like straightforward way, people who feel stuck in one mode of perception, whether it's that there's no self or there's no doer, and are really suffering because of that, and are suffering because they feel that either, I'm being told by non-dual teachers that this is the true way, this is the way that reality is. If you question it, you're ignorant, or it's just an ego trip, or you're damned to suffer, or what have you. And so there's a really strong influence there that I definitely got stuck in. People that I support with my spiritual emergency got stuck in. And so I really want to kind of pick your brain and your soul about all of this. So, with no further ado, my spiel is over. And I have some more sort of pointed questions about all of this, but I thought it would be great to give you a chance, like you gave me, to give like a little um, if you can, sort of like a nutshell version of how did you get to non-dual teachings, Neo-Advaita, what led you there? And then after that, maybe we can talk about the insights that we just sort of, I just sort of highlighted.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Jessica. That was amazing. A lot of great context there on this conversation. Thank you for setting the stage.
Yeah.
And yeah, happy to give some background on my story. Maybe what I'll do is just kind of say in my own words a bit about where I've arrived at currently. Of course, it's like a never-ending unfolding. Just describe in my own words what you touched upon, and then I'll kind of
Cool.
do a flashback to the past and kind of come to the present.
Nice.
So, yeah, as Jessica said, I'm in a space where where I really feel very free to play among many modes of life. I feel like the paradigm that I'm exploring could be called fluidity or multidimensionality or all-inclusivity, or I kind of like this idea of just many modes. And the idea is basically that everything that non-duality and Neo-Advaita points to, and which many teachers claim is kind of like the ultimate state or the final state or the absolute truth, the way it shows up for me now is that no, that's not the absolute truth any more than this right now is the absolute truth. I don't really like even using the word absolute or ultimate truth now, but to me it just feels like everything, every mode of being is fully reality, and we don't need to create any kind of hierarchy. And the modes that are pointed at by non-dual and Neo-Advaita teachers, those are just other modes of being. Those are other ways that this can seem to be, other ways that reality can be with itself, other, incredibly poetic, heart-cracking ways that God can be with God, if you want to use the word God to describe all that is. You can use whatever words you like: mystery, being, reality. For me, every way that God can be with God, every way that reality can be with reality is incredibly creative and artistic and poetic. It's like we just, to me, seem to be swimming through numberless master artworks. Like this right now is a master artwork beyond fathoming, infinitely detailed every single moment. And every moment is just opening into, it's like lotus flowers within lotus flowers, just master artworks morphing into next iterations of master artworks. And every single one of those ways that this can seem to be is all fully reality, fully this infinite, all-inclusive continuum of what is. And we're fully free to explore the full range of modes, whatever range of modes we're able to access if we're inclined to explore them, and we're fully free to find our own natural flow, our own natural center of gravity, our own natural role, moment by moment, day by day. It's an ever shifting thing amidst this endless range of modes. And we're fully free to allow whatever the presently appearing context or environment is to call forth the honest expression of us that plays most auspiciously with whatever that context or environment is. And from this view, something like being a human being and playing with my daughter and being close with my wife and sharing connection, that is no less real, no less valid, no less fully the astonishing miracle of what is, as having some kind of immersion in no self or emptiness, where this moment becomes like just a vaporous, weightless, play of ever shifting luminosity with nothing behind it. That's also, an interesting mode to explore. Can be very liberating to explore that type of mode. But where I'm at, it just seems like every mode is fully reality. And that feels very, very freeing, very liberating, because there's no longer a feeling of like looking for the ultimate mode or the final state, or like, oh, I just need to imitate the state of Tony Parsons or Jim Newman. I just need to reach the state that they're in and then freeze that state forever and just stay there. It's like, no, that's not freedom. That's that's a strange kind of imitation of someone that you're putting on a pedestal, who's really, their experience is no more true or absolute than the experience of a sloth napping on a tree branch. It's it's all fully this. So rewinding to talk a bit about how I arrived at this point um in the exploration. So I was always very curious. I was raised Catholic actually as a child, and I was asking questions from very early on about, what is God, and does God really exist? Where are the limits of the universe and stuff like this? And um yeah, my curiosity led me to ultimately become disillusioned with Catholicism and abandon the faith around age 18 or so. Um which, interestingly, a whole other story is kind of like this full circle journey that gradually led to me becoming kind of a meta Christian years later and reintegrating much of the rituals and meaning structures of my native tongue religiously, because the religion we're born into is like our native language of relating to the meaningfulness of life. And so healing my relationship with Christianity has actually been really key part of my process. But anywho, I became disillusioned around age 18. That kind of threw me into these waters of flirting with atheism and nihilism and agnosticism. And then I found myself experimenting with psychedelics starting around age 19, first with magic mushrooms. Well, first with cannabis and then magic mushrooms. And that was really when things opened up in quite a profound way. From my current lens, I would say that was when I first opened to a radically wider range of modes than what I had been conditioned into, because most humans are conditioned into a certain subset, you know, a fairly fixed bandwidth of modes that they explore. I mean, if anyone was to look closer, they could discover that actually every moment presents numberless fresh modes and flavors and textures, and that's true for all of us, it seems to me, and the moment it never repeats itself, and that's part of the astonishing freshness of what is. But that was kind of the moment when I was first exposed to, oh, reality includes a much broader range of modes and possibilities than I had ever assumed or taken to be. So it was kind of I began to experience a radical opening to life and a radical opening to a much vaster range of modes through psychedelic experimentation. And I had some of my first experiences with what could be called non-dual modes or no self modes already around that time at age 19. And so that catalyzed, I'm almost 34 now, so it's been 14 or 15 years of a kind of quest that was catalyzed by that radical opening to life and that radical reactivation of my innate curiosity and my sense of, oh, the mystery of life is not solved. It's not just written in the back of the textbook and I just need to memorize it and regurgitate it at the right moments. The mystery of life is alive and well, and I can explore this and become a student of this and find my own answers. And so that is the quest that I've been on since then, and it's been a pretty wild ride. It led to a lot of travel. I think been to some 35 countries or something. So I lived quite nomadically for many years and really explored the ends of the earth physically and the ends and edges of consciousness internally to just really leave no stone unturned in my exploration of what is. And it led to deeper shamanic initiations with a lot of ayahuasca, a lot of bufo, 5-MeO DMT. So the most profound psychedelics, and experiencing full on like dissolutions of the entire universe, just melting into what could be called the light of God. It just unimaginable experiences occurred during these years of exploration. And it was really around 2019 after a breakup, a heartbreak, that I plunged deeper into the world of non-dual teachings and radical non-duality. Like I said, I had already begun exploring non-duality for like years earlier. I'd been reading Alan Watts, and I had read Eckhart Tolle even in my younger years, and Lao Tzu and stuff, but it didn't draw me in as much at that time. But then something about 2019, when I was really, really suffering after this heartbreak, I really got drawn in by the writings of Eckhart Tolle and David Hawkins and Pema Chodron and Byron Katie and Jed McKenna. Jed McKenna really impacted me, and Jed McKenna, I would say, is one of the more dangerous figures in Neo-Advaita. I would say he's one of the most powerful writers who ever lived, but that's not necessarily always a good thing. I'd say he's a dangerous writer because he will shake the very foundations of a person's belief system, identity, worldview. He'll stab all of your sacred cows with a sharp stick. And yeah, generally, I would not recommend people to read Jed McKenna unless they feel very, very kind of solid within themselves, or they really want to be tested or something like that. So that was my initiation into kind of radical non-duality, Neo-Advaita. I then, it led to me. So that happened, and then there was this quite profound ayahuasca retreat where I was romantically involved with this shaman, and she broke up with me right before the retreat, and I still went to the retreat, and I drank like 4 nights in a row. This woman who I'm madly in love with, I just want to run away with and travel the world. She just broke my heart. She's serving me tall cups of thick Peruvian ayahuasca 4 nights in a row, and I'm just like drinking these down, and like I didn't even know how I was going to survive. It was like the craziest couple weeks of my life, and I was like vomiting for hours and just sobbing for hours after drinking this brew. This is a whole other crazy episode, but it is relevant because after, like, in ceremony 2, after hours of that, I broke through into this kind of just pristine white light and just dissolved into the white light. And that was kind of the first time that had ever happened, like a near total dissolution experience, which kind of was like foreshadowing later Bufo 5-MeO DMT experiences where the same thing would happen quite a few more times. But anywho, that was a moment where I came out of that and really felt like, oh, that was it. That was it. Like I'm awake now. I get it. I've woken up. And the danger there, and a common danger with psychedelics, is that I developed quite a grandiosity after that, kind of a guru complex, kind of a god complex. And I just felt like, I get it. I get what all these non-dual guys are talking about. And I interpreted what had happened to me through the lens of the non-dual philosophies that I'd been really, really deeply bathing in leading up to that point. And then I just doubled down, of course, on reading way more non-dual philosophy, reading more Jed McKenna, diving into, all the usual suspects, Adyashanti, Jim Newman, Tony Parsons, Nisargadatta, Ramana Maharshi, Krishnamurti. both Krishnamurtis and, you know, all these types of guys. And that's been a very interesting exploration. And that auspiciously, somehow, through a friend, I was guided to Peter Brown around year 2020. And thankfully, Peter Brown, I feel like discovering Peter Brown was kind of the beginning of the discovery of fluidity or multidimensionality, because Peter talks about multidimensionality, and he was the first one I'd ever really heard use this language of modes, and like all modes are fully actual, all modes are fully true, all modes are fully it, and freedom is just finding your own natural center of gravity among this range of modes on this all-inclusive continuum of being. And so discovering Peter, who some people would lump Peter in with non-duality, but yeah, I'd say he doesn't really fit the bill when it comes to a lot of the kind of traps of different non-dual teachers. And to be fair, as we've discussed before, there are plenty of non-dual teachers who don't fall into a lot of the traps that you and I have discussed and the shadows. And so through Peter, I also came to discover John Aston and Dina Evans and Joan Tollefson, Shiv Sengupta, Robert Saltzman, and all these types of people. Some people would call them non-dual, and they call themselves non-dual in some cases, but they have more nuanced and kind of all-inclusive views and are less rigid about a lot of things. So that was an important bridge, discovering those types of people, and especially Peter Brown. And then, yeah, along the way, there's been exploration of many wisdom traditions. I said there was this kind of reintegration of a lot of the Christian operating system of my youth, which was very important after becoming a father and family man, to be able to like stay put in the pressure cooker of family life, because it turns out that the Christian operating system is really well suited to that. Anywho, and there was also an integration of a lot of stuff from other wisdom traditions. I'm not in any way limiting myself to what's in the Christian operating system, but to bring this to a close, basically, I was fortunate to discover Peter's work and some of those other teachers, and that gradually helped me start to see a lot of the shadows within much of the non-duality space. And I would say it was really only within the last few months when I had probably the deepest immersion into the modes of emptiness or no self that I have ever experienced. And it was really quite intense for a couple months there. I spent a lot of time just feeling like this is a vaporous, luminous, weightless kind of display of ungraspable God nectar, and there's nothing behind it. And that was, very free for me, a very freeing and liberating mode. But kind of coming out of that or watching that continue to morph in subtle ways, that's when it really clicked that like, oh, this is just another mode. This is just another way reality can seem to be and can be with itself. It's not the ultimate truth or the absolute truth any more than me eating a slice of pizza is the absolute truth. And that just kind of really dawned on me, really clicked and integrated and was really deeply internalized. And that was super freeing, and that's allowed me to now, even some of the people I listed who were really helpful in bridging the gap for me, even some of them, I look at some things they're saying in their work now where they're kind of putting non-doership on a pedestal, or, you know, really putting anything on a pedestal. I now just see that as like, okay, you're claiming that one mode is like more it than another mode, but I just really can't see it that way now. Or I mean, I can see how you could see it that way, but that's just not how it shows up for me now. It just shows up as like, no, non-doership is another mode you can play with, and doership or creatorship or participation is a mode you can play with, and they're both valid ways that reality can seem to be. And an important point is that no single mode, even though reality is fully present in every expression and every mode, no single mode can ever fully pin down or fully encapsulate or fully monopolize what this all-inclusive infinity is. It transcends and includes all of its modes. It's just forever beyond and forever opening into more of itself. So yeah, that was a mouthful. I hope that was interesting.
Yeah, that was great. I hope you didn't mind. I, like, jotted a few things down so I wouldn't be holding them in my head because there's so many, like, jumping off points that I'm like, "Hmm, which point do I wanna jump from?" But I think I'll just flow with, like, um, first of all, thank you for sharing all that, and it's a very fascinating journey and all the stages that you went through. Um, I think one of the things that I'm curious about, like, to correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like in some ways, um, you were sort of buffered from getting stuck in a lot of the traps that people get stuck in because you did sort of discover these perspectives that you had in mind that, okay, no, there isn't just one mode that's the ultimate truth. And you kind of embraced almost like preferring to experience reality and perceive reality as open-ended. And so, I mean, I'm only saying that because you didn't mention sort of going through any, like, major crises of, like, let's say, getting stuck in non-doership and that may be affecting your relationships or what have you, and I don't know if that did happen, but there is something I think that I find, like, really, well, let's just say, cool that, perhaps you were able to not fall into, like, the darkest of the traps because you sort of, maybe before you got stuck in anything, were able to kinda see, "Wait a minute, like, let's not get stuck into this ultimate truth trap," or what have you.
Yeah, there's a couple things that come up there. I mean, for one, I think having my daughter in 2021 really shielded me from a lot of the worst of it because I think a lot of these non-dual gurus, they tend to be childless men who don't have kids, and I think once you hold your baby in your arms and you stare into your baby's eyes and you weep for the precious miracle of this being that somehow you've co-created, it just changes you and it hits so deep and it's incredibly grounding into the human experience and the earthly experience. And so I think that was something that kind of shielded me and like snapped me out of some of the traps. But I did experience some of the traps and shadows in a pretty significant way. Like I would say Jed McKenna had me genuinely like afflicted with a fair amount of suffering over questions of like solipsism. Like, am I the only one here? Is there no one other than this one consciousness, and I'm just this one consciousness? And I was pretty afflicted by that. I was pretty afflicted by because he also makes the claim that life is completely meaningless, and so I was also afflicted by this question of like, is life just completely meaningless?
Yeah.
And then some of the non-dual guys, like Jim Newman especially, lured me into this kind of carrot on a stick trap of feeling like, "Oh, I'm not awake yet or liberated yet because my self has not permanently fallen away, or I can still have an experience of feeling like Jordan, like feeling a sense of Jordanness, emanating here." And it's so strange that they, you know, tell you that unconditional freedom requires this condition of zero selfing in order to be unconditionally free. And yeah, now I just see that as completely ludicrous. It's just not the case at all. But yeah, I was kind of hoodwinked into that type of intense seeking. So and I think I just naturally was a pretty intense seeker for a lot of years already, but different things really hooked into me and kind of directed the seeking in certain directions. Like also, I remember Bentinho Massaro's ideas of like you need to penetrate the absolute and the absolute is beyond God. That's another one that I just see now as like that is just a dark, magical, devilish carrot on a stick. Burn that shit down. That's complete horse hockey. It's a horribly misleading use of the human language to say that.
Mhm.
'Cause it this is the absolute right now, there's nothing to penetrate, it's just fully revealed for our inspection. I mean, what could be more present than presence? What could be more awake than awakeness? This is already shining, it's already miraculous, and we can just check it out whenever we want. But this idea that I needed to penetrate something that made it feel like it's somewhere else, and this idea that myself needed to completely fall away, these types of things brought me a lot of confusion for a long time, and thankfully, Peter Brown was big in helping me see through some of this stuff. Like, I remember one moment where I asked him, Peter, these other guys are saying like, you need to penetrate the absolute and you need to ascend through the jhanas and dissolve every last speck of solidity. And I need to penetrate para Brahman. And Peter was just like, that's all hogwash. This is it right now. This is the one reality. And there's nothing other than this right here, right now. And yeah, whatever he said in that moment, it was just like a moment of profound
Mm.
transmission where I just like had to giggle. I just started like giggling. It felt so good to have these carrots on a stick, like just chopped away, and just to be told, you know, what you're looking for is this right now. This is home. However, whatever mode it's
Mm.
displaying as, or emerging as, or manifesting as, whatever mode you're exploring, that's fully it. That's fully home, and you are always home within this tapestry of being, however it happens to be emerging in this moment. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just to like circle back a little bit to like the Jed McKenna types, like I often think of them as sort of like militant non-dualists, or kind of like I don't know, like they come in with like a wrecking ball to like destroy everything in sight without care for, how it affects anybody. But I just remember folks like that, like really they got me involved in this sort of like what felt like a bloody crusade against the self and against like the illusion of the world and the false self, and everything was sort of like destruction and killing and burning, and it was really like this language of violence that was starting a very grim sort of like aggressive war against all these parts of oneself. And what I also hear you saying a lot, which was like big shift for me, was like this shift from like reality is a process of exclusion to like an exercise in including more and more into what we consider to be reality. And that's something that kind of broke down a lot of the non-dual kind of belief system that I had, which, as you and I talked about, like it goes beyond a belief system because you start to experience reality kind of with those ideas. The ideas might sort of fall away at times, but you're still holding them within your kind of subconscious. But that sense of like, well, wait a minute, like you said, this whole condition of like, you can only get to wholeness once you remove something from the whole. Like, that doesn't add up anymore. That's like, how do you get the whole picture by like carving pieces of it out? So, this whole sort of shift to like reality includes the ego, includes the self, like you said, like transcends and includes, not this whole like transcendence is about, excluding this or seeing through that. So, like, I always have in my head this quote from Adyashanti, who I followed very um, deeply, was like every moment of transcendence is a mortal blow to the ego. And I just look back at that and I'm like, this is so misguided and so different from what I've arrived at, which is absolutely not that like transcending, going beyond or expanding like beyond something doesn't mean that you negate what you've gone beyond, that you include that in a bigger view. And so it really, I'm just appreciating like your view of inclusivity and the fact that you were able to find, like, for me, I see it as like sometimes there's like these stepping stones that kind of move you away from some of the more radical stuff. So you might find, like you mentioned, some of those other non-dual teachers might still teach things that have some of the traps in it, but they also have like these really great sort of gems of wisdom and perspectives that can help you be like, oh, okay, that's misguided. And I had, a lot of those types of people. Like for me, and I know that you've kind of dipped into him a bit too, is like people like Tim Freak that were saying like, yeah, it's a dream character, but it's beautiful and engage in it and don't get rid of anything. Like what a magic mystery ride with all of these, amazing characters. And it was like, oh, and he has a big, colorful personality. Like it's okay to have a personality and like talk about oneness, was just like, oh my God. And it was so much more like delicious and incredible to me, though it took a while to like get on board with like, not believing he's deluded because he thinks he exists. But so it's cool to hear your process of like, taking bits and pieces from other people that were challenging more of like the militant type of exclusionary perspective. And then, God, there's so many places I want to go. I want to talk about, okay, let's first go to having a child. So I also, Tim Freak is someone who introduced me to this perspective because, I got into non-duality when I was like 24 and I'm almost 39 now and I haven't had kids, but I do love kids. And I always thought like one day I'll have kids. And, um, after I got into this whole ego dissolution path, and I was really like my personality was like thinning out and becoming very sort of empty and hollow. And I started to really lose that sense of like spontaneous, joyful engagement with anything other than, this absolute appearing, shining radiance with nothing behind it, like you said, or this sort of peacefulness that only I could experience within myself. I became super withdrawn and started like noticing when I was like playing with my niece that, like, oh my God, like, there's no one here to like to play and there's nothing that I'm offering that's like, playful and funny. I lost my sense of humor and it hit me that like, wait a minute, like I can't have a family from this way that I've become of like this sort of hollowed out shell of a person with no real sort of impulse to participate or engage or of course not play make believe, God forbid. Um, but that was something that hit me, and then a huge thing, and I think it's very overlooked, so I wanna talk about it a lot, is a lot of people who I speak to who have been harmed in some ways by, this whole quest of ego death or ego dissolution or absorbing teachings that things are an illusion only, that really messed up their families. I've heard everything from, like, children being taken out of somebody's custody to having to get divorced because, they couldn't hold up the relationship anymore. They became so distant and like unempathic, lost their desire for intimacy. But a lot of times people will just say that, like, I lost my connection with my children. And some of them are weeping as they tell the story of like these years where they would look at their child as just an illusion. I know a woman who shared that her son committed suicide after he began to only be able to see his family as in a delusion. And like you said, solipsism, like he got stuck in that mode that like, when I die, they're going to disappear because they're a projection of my consciousness only. And not to say that it was just Neo-Advaita that did that. It was a conglomeration of things, but it certainly was supercharged by that sense of, well, nothing matters because nothing's real anyway. But on like the more less extreme side, just parents will say things like, I gained so much. Probably my biggest challenge is having to let go of the idea that my kids are real and things like that. But then, you'll hear from people like you and people like Tim that will be like, actually, the moment that I had a child was the moment that I was like, no, we're not getting rid of individuality. And like you said, I would never teach my child this. And then sort of reevaluating, when you have kids, I imagine, and I think about it a lot, is like what, like you said, like what myths and what narratives and what meaning and value systems do we want to impart to our children in the next generation? And is it really that nothing exists and your individuality doesn't matter and the purpose of life is to, escape suffering by negating your desires and your preferences and all of that? And I think a lot of people, it strikes them as like, oh, wait a minute, maybe there's something not quite right here, or what we really want everyone to start taking on. And so I guess I just really appreciate that. And I was wondering if, did you have any experiences like that, or like where you were with your daughter and you could sort of like catch a glimpse of like, oh, if I was looking at her as like just this illusion, like how that might harm the relationship or anything there?
Um, yeah, a few months ago when I mentioned going into that mode of deeply into emptiness and no self that just kind of spontaneously arose through a lot of a certain type of more negating type of inquiry, which again is another mode you can explore. You can explore modes of negation, and those can lead to fascinating places, right? It's like the smorgasbord is fully available, but it's a question of what is really skillful and artful for you and what feels right for you. And as you say, not getting stuck in a particular mode, is feels really key for for most of us, I would say. So yeah, when I was deeply in that mode of emptiness and no self for a while, I did allow it to even temporarily like hollow out my family to the point where I was just seeing everything, including my family, with as this like miraculous display of, luminosity, weightless no thingness with nothing behind it. Um, and that interestingly, that didn't disconnect me from, um, my family. I still felt connected and still felt like, wow, I'm seeing, like, another dimension of my family, like, seeing their infinity or their, you know,
Yeah.
miraculousness in kind of a new way, but at the same time, that just didn't couldn't last very long because then I had this experience of just looking in my daughter's eyes when we were playing, like, hide and seek, and she, like, pops out from this blanket fort and is, like, just smiling at me, and I'm listening to Einaudi in the background and this Italian folk singer singing over this Einaudi gorgeous piano song, and I just looked in her eyes, just started weeping, and it just felt like from that space of emptiness, this giant, loving, warm bear hug of fullness, this huge embrace of formfulness, this explosion of the heart just occurred, and I was just weeping and overflowing with love, and I just felt like, you know, uh, no, this is not, all negation is not the mode for me. Maybe it's the mode for some people, or, just purely fixating emptiness is not the way for me. This formfulness is just as fully real, just as fully valid, just as fully what is. And so there was this huge re-embracing of formfulness, and then that continued to evolve into this kind of, as I was saying, just deeper and deeper clarity about fluidity and all these just being modes that it's like every mode reveals new sides or angles on this infinite-sided jewel, this infinite-sided polyhedron of reality. But again, no mode can fully encapsulate or monopolize it, and no mode is any more real than another mode in a very profound sense. Um, and some people might say, well, isn't that just pure relativism? And, isn't that going to get us in trouble? And I guess what I would say to that is, as you were saying, recognizing that like all modes are fully reality does not prevent us from asking the question, which which modes do we actually want to tell our children about, recommend to our children? Which modes do we actually want to encode within the mythologies and the stories and the maps that we pass on to our children? And is there a way in which this understanding of fluidity or all-inclusivity can actually lead toward creating more beautiful maps and mythologies and stories we pass on to our children, because we familiarized ourselves with a fuller range of what's possible and what's available, and we can then look at that and say, which of these modes and expressions and ways of being tend to create and align with what tend to be universal human values, and the outcomes that we're actually looking for. The more beautiful world our hearts know is possible, the world of peace and unity that 99% of people want. Most people just want to be able to just exist and be with their loved ones and enjoy life, and it shouldn't be that hard to create that. So, yeah.
Yeah. I see what you mean, and it's cool that you bring up the whole question of, like, relativity because that's something that I hit too where I'm like, "Okay, well, so now I'm saying that, like, you know, reality is whatever you make it to be." I think, like, we don't have to go too far into it, but what I've arrived at for me that's felt good and healthy is, like, first of all, that what that opens up is this new sort of, um compass for it's really about choice for me, is that now that I could take off the table, like, okay, base like a path or a philosophy that you're gonna get involved in and choose like a spiritual path based on whether is it the ultimate truth and it's gonna make you enlightened or it's gonna end all of your suffering, to know which of these pathways is also healthy and which of these pathways actually is based on humanistic values that's relational and participatory and believes in the sanctity of the individual and human life, and that it's okay to have preferences towards what direction I want society to go in and what world I want the next generation of kids to live in. And is this, pathway that the ultimate purpose of life is to negate ourselves and escape, the world that's just like the shitty, you know, fallen from purity, and we have to get back to that by negating all these beautiful things. Is that what I want the world to be led by in general? No. And I'm okay saying that I have that preference. And I also feel like while I think that all these different modes are valid and can be beneficial, I do still have a sense and like a desire to kind of discern what I think is maybe most true or more true. Like if it comes to the question of like, well, is it true that the self doesn't exist? That's like, I don't find that to be super compelling anymore as a description of what is actually true, but I think it is a valid way that you could experience reality. I don't, you know, preoccupy myself as much with like which is the truth or not the truth, and more so, like I'm saying, with what feels healthiest and what kind of brings out the types of qualities and like motivations that I find beautiful and important. Um, so for me, the whole sort of many modes thing unlocks something that I see as so precious, which is choice, which is what for me the non-dual path took away, where it was about no choice and giving up control and not having preferences and just hunkering down in that one impersonal absence of self mode, where then I lost the choice to be able to be like, as you said, in one moment or the other. Like I was not able to engage as an aunt anymore. I was not able to enjoy and hold up my end of a conversation anymore. So that whole question of like, shouldn't liberation mean opening you up to the choice to engage in any dimension, not losing some of them? So I super appreciate that. Maybe we'll go down that rabbit hole another time. Another thing I wanted to talk about was one more thing about children. And we had also talked about how, and you said it's a lot of non-dual teachers are like single men, but I can also say a lot of them are childless women, and I've noticed that as well. And so one of the things that I also consider a lot is like what gets lost in decontextualizing these like generally renunciate Eastern pathways for what we would call like sort of householders in the West who are socially engaged and relationally and familially. Some of the safeguards that they had that now I feel like more of these like direct paths that like cut out any preparation or any of that stuff lose a lot of that. For example, like, with Kabbalah, for example, which is a really deep mysticism that's very transpersonal, they have like a guidance that you don't really get into this until you're in a later stage in life. Like after you've had children or the children have left, because of the fact that it can do that to you. It can withdraw you from life, and it can, in my perspective, a lot of the wisdom there was that it could make it difficult for you to carry on your householder responsibilities. So when I think about like some of the safeguards that I would like to see kind of come in, or some of those things, it's like, hey, one of the things you might want to consider is like, are you about to have a baby? Are there people that are, relying on you for their well-being? Or, do you need to be able to continue in this livelihood in order to exist and support others? Right now might be a time that you want to consider not following this path because it's very radical, and a lot of people go through periods of dysfunction and withdrawal and aren't able to continue with that. So just wanted to tie in a little bit of like that kind of appropriating renunciate paths for householders, what some of the downsides are of that, and things to be aware of for people. And I don't know if you want to say anything there, or I can jump into the next
Um,
one.
yeah, one thing I wanted to say, that's a good point, and yeah, I think we need to be sensitive about what is a person's lifestyle, and does it make sense to dive deep into modes that were primarily reserved for monks when we're householders. So that's a cool point. One other point I wanted to make, just on the truth question of like, well, what is, if these are all valid experiential modes, what is actually true? And That's a really interesting question for me. I was talking to my wife about this the other day, and she said the same thing, like, well, what some of those modes might actually be pointing toward what is actually true. And so, yeah, I was contemplating on that and just feeling like I don't know how we would ever know though. I really can't like with the space I'm in, I can't see how you could determine from the way we experience life what is the objective, final, absolute, or ultimate truth of how things actually are. Like for me, reality really seems deeply experiential. Like the way things are changes depending on who's observing it, how you're observing it, who's experiencing it. And, they've even discovered this at the quantum level that reality looks different depending on whether it's being observed or not, or, from what angle it's being observed. And so I just get the sense that reality just really is not just one way that could ever be pinned down, and that it is this kind of fractal kaleidoscopic jewel of ever expanding morphingness that can be seen from numberless angles. And at the same time, when it comes to like, okay, but then how do you navigate and how do what is your compass then for truth and the good, the true and the beautiful? And I would just say from a human perspective, for me, the heart is really fundamental, which feels like on one level speaking about the actual human heart and whatever this center of energy is here that just feels like it goes to the very heart of life. For me, that's the idea of being heart-led or heart-centered is really important to me, and I'm fully in favor of using all forms of one's intelligence and one's holistic beingness to sense the whole of life and flow with life in that way. But for me, really like what the heart knows and what the heart feels. And when I'm feeling that unconditional love, where I'm feeling like reality unconditionally loves me and I'm just crying, or I'm feeling like I unconditionally love my daughter and I'm just crying, those are the moments which for me experientially feel like I'm touching the deepest truth. And that is the deepest North Star that I orient my life around or
Mhm.
attempt to. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think probably I won't go too much further in this for now, but I think, like, when we talk about truth, there's, like, ontological truth that a lot of people get sort of into, of like, what is the nature of being? Like, what is the nature of isness? And you get into all these metaphysics, and maybe I think that's where the biggest mystery is. But then you get to like everyday stuff, and like then I feel like the need to have like an agreement that, like, you know, this is there and that is there. And then, maybe when you get into questions of I wouldn't say necessarily politics, but, like, getting sort in, like, social issues and world issues, like, there's such, like, uh, what's the word? We're in the day of like fake news and things like that. And I think it is important to be able to discern sort of truth from lies when it comes to, these social issues and world issues, and in order to be able to like fully understand what's going on and what to do about it. But I feel like those are kind of two different sort of maybe types of truths and ways of discerning them that probably is beyond like the meat of our conversation for now. Um
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good distinction to make that, we can talk about kind of the truth of events more or less like what happened, but saying what happened from that human layer of reality doesn't say what that is though, what it most fundamentally is ontologically. So that's a good distinction you're making. And one quick point that I feel like tossing in here, if it's okay, for me, this was one of the most mind-blowing insights that I think I heard while listening to Tim Freak talking to Daniel Schmachtenberger. I don't know if you've listened to their
I did.
engagements at all, but Schmachtenberger made an incredibly lucid point that materialists and non-dualists actually mirror each other in a certain fallacy that they've committed of basically they start with certain ontological assumptions and then they create an epistemology that is based on those assumptions that will inevitably seem to experientially prove the validity of their ontological model. So in the case of materialism, like you start with the assumption that this is a material reality and matter is all there is, and the only way we can learn about objectivity is to look at things very closely and do these experiments. And then you create an epistemology based on that, the epistemology of science, the understanding of how we gain knowledge, and you attempt to gain knowledge only through studying things as if they were just physical material phenomena. And then, of course, that seems to prove your ontology that there's only physical material phenomena. And similarly, non-dualists have historically created an ontology that says there's only consciousness, there's only this naked display of light right here and now. And then
Yeah.
they create an epistemology based on just only stay with experience as if there's only this immediate flash of experience, and just stay there and just study it that way. And then, of course, that epistemology ends up seeming to prove their ontology, but both miss that, like, in both cases, they're deeply internalizing certain assumptions and perspectives, and then those assumptions and perspectives are becoming experiential for them, and they've developed a toolkit that has those assumptions baked into it, and that will inevitably seem to prove their assumptions. But it turns out that, you know, that happens on both sides of the spectrum, if you take the full-on materialist view or the full-on non-dualist view. So that reveals something super interesting about this kind of paradoxical, many modes, fluid nature of what is, and how any perspective deeply internalized will tend to become experiential and will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But
Right.
then latching onto that and saying it shows why latching on to any one, seeming experiential mode and saying this proves my ontology, why that tends to be, a grave error. So that's a subtle point, but I found that like a gorgeous, mind-blowing point.
Yeah. I think it's actually one of the biggest points that actually I wanted to get to, because for me, understanding, like, one way that I've heard it described is like sort of like a self-verifying or self-validating loop where, for me and most people, the whole narrative in the type of non-duality that we're talking about, when you get into things like self-inquiry and what is often called like these direct pointers, that you're being directly pointed to the truth with these set of questions or these sort of practices or sort of mind exercises. And the whole narrative that once you see it, then it's self-evident. So if you're told, hammered again and again, there is no self, there is no self, and once you have this experience of self dropping away, then it's proven that there is no self and it never existed and never will and never does. And that whole loop, that's like this closed loop, really solidifies that sense that I have seen the ultimate truth. Partly, I think, because you've got these ancient traditions that have been saying this for so long that you're like, oh, well, it must be true because it's all this ancient wisdom that, who am I to question it? But when we talk about people getting stuck in that ultimate truth trap, like, one of the biggest challenges is people saying, like, I wish that I could at least, like, decrease my conviction that this is the only possible way that it is. And one of the strongest ways that I found is unpacking these direct pointers to see that when they say self-inquiry or discover the true self or self-realization, you're not being given an open-ended discovery of like, oh, who's my authentic true self? Let me go inside and contemplate, who am I? Although it's kind of this illusion where they're like, yes, go in and ask, who am I, who am I, who am I, in self-inquiry. But they're telling you what you have to answer, what you have to find. And they're also saying, like you said, the assumption that's baked in is that if you can't locate your sense of self, then it can't be real. And if it's temporary and it can fall away and come back, then it's obviously not real. So go inside, see the temporary unlocatability, improve, this undeniable self-evident truth that the self is complete non-existent, imposter, fallacy, whatever. So it's exactly what you're saying. So then I was able to be like, oh, I was pointed to have a very unique experience. And I like calling them direct pointers, but pointing out that, like, what they're really good at is giving you an experience that's very different from your familiar experience. So they're really effective in getting you to open up this other mode of perceiving. But are they really pointing you to like an already present fact that is the ultimate final truth, I would say no. So being able to unpack that question of like, how do we know what's true, and like, how do we come to discern truth, which is, kind of what epistemology is based on, is a huge important key to like unlock that freedom of perception. It's like, well, no, you didn't see, well, in my perspective, you weren't pointed to the undeniable truth. You were pointed to one way of perceiving that was a pre-given notion. So it's also kind of dogma. Like you said, you experienced that in Catholicism. Like Jesus is the savior. Once you experience Jesus, then Jesus is the savior or what have you. And then you're guided to have this experience that feels like Jesus, or however it's described in Catholicism. But then, people like you and a lot of people come to question, well, I had that experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean that X, Y, and Z are the truth. So from there, I wanted to ask you, what do you think you could say or offer to people who are feeling stuck in one mode of perception? And what I had like written to myself is that like there's kind of like, I would say at least three reasons why people get stuck in, whether it's non-doership or it's impersonhood, or everything's an illusion, nothing matters. Is like, one is that belief that it's the only truth, so turning away from it's betraying the truth. Then you've got the belief that this is salvation, so if I go back to modes of perceiving people as real, then I'm going to suffer forever. But then the other one, I think, that I would be curious to hear from you is just the logistics of switching modes, because people will come out of psychedelics and feel like it's really hard to get back into the familiar sense of reality, even if they believe that, solipsism is not true and it's not saving them from suffering. How can I even get myself to not feel that anymore? And I sometimes think about it as like getting like a lens stuck on the camera and you can't get it off. So, I experience, and some people experience, like, I really want to start perceiving choice again and perceiving, people as these integrated wholes. But I don't know how, because I've gone so long seeing it as otherwise. How can I open myself to like literally logistically getting into another mode? So I don't know if you have any like maybe practical advice or encouragement that it's possible when you feel like it's not.
Yeah, great question. I'll answer that in a sec. There were just a couple more things that came up when you were talking about other stuff that I just wanted to quickly share. So for one, I just found it important to say that this word self is really so crucial and something to look at so closely when it comes to these teachings. And I love that Tim Freak really dialed in on this, and he, you know, would ask different people. Like, I think I saw him talk with Richard Sylvester and say, but what do you mean by the word self? When you're saying there's no self, what do you mean by that? Because that's crucial. Are you saying there's no homunculus in there pulling levers? I can get on board with that. And that's the thing. It's like these people can rarely pin down what they even mean when they're saying the self is not there. Because it's like, okay, if I define self as a psychophysical organism, that is emanating a general flavor of Jordanness, then it's basically impossible to deny that there's a self right here. And so what do you mean by self? And when you drill down on that, you finally start to get into, well, what we mean is more like there's this feeling of being apart from reality. That's really what they're talking about, is this sense of like, I am apart from reality, and the universe is kind of out there, and there's this sense of like alienation of being somehow like sealed off or apart from reality, which at this point I would say, yes. So that's another valid mode, the sense of being apart from reality, a mode that can be explored. And I do think it's super, super beautiful and important to invite people to explore tools that can help them discover the modes where they don't feel apart from reality. Because I think that is one of the biggest gifts in non-duality, is that it can help people arrive at a felt recognition that they do belong here and they're not apart from this. They're they're part of this. They are this. This is home. And I would say if there's the other thing you were talking about with the pointers, I totally agree that so many pointers are just pointing at different modes and then claiming that that's the absolute truth rather than just another interesting angle or way this can seem to be. But if there is like one undeniable thing that these pointers point at, something that I would say is actually undeniable, you could just say it as this is this this
Right.
is here. reality
Reality.
reality is. And that is maybe like the one pointer to pay the most attention to in non-duality, because the best, I'd say the best people are just repeatedly pointing at just that. This is. Let yourself really feel that this aliveness, whatever this is, this mysterious, enchanting explosion of flavor, it's actually here, and it's juicy, and it's dripping with voluptuousness and hyper meaningfulness. It's radiating in every direction. It's splendid. It's artful. Let yourself feel it and just be with the positivity, the actuality that this is here. And just doing that tends to have very positive benefits for a lot of people, because it does tend to dissolve that sense of kind of dissociation, being apart from this and turning this into a mental idea of just like a hostile, cold, random universe. It's like there are other modes available where this can feel like intimacy and home, and you recognize that this is here and it's miraculous that it's here. I can't even say what it
Yeah.
is. So I wanted to mention that. And as far as your question about how people can get unstuck if they're like stuck in some of these less desirable modes and they're becoming problematic. I mean, honestly, I think one of the best ways is just to listen to your channel and listen to your conversations with Tim Freak and some of the, playlists with critiques of non-duality and Neo-Advaita, conversations like this. I feel like, as you're saying, listening to people deconstruct these things, I think for a lot of people, that would probably be one of the best ways to kind of break the spell, break the hypnosis of like reality is only one way and I've seen how it is and I have to freeze myself in this mode. And other than that, I would really just strongly recommend grounding and embodiment practices. For example, somatic therapies like Hakomi. Hakomi is a really good kind of like parts work, like a somatic parts work type therapy where you really go into the body with a practitioner. I think just really coming back into the physical body and letting yourself feel that this is solidly here. This is bones and muscle and cartilage and sinew and organs, and it's full of viscerality and intimacy, becoming intimate with the body. Grounding practices such as getting your bare feet on the earth, laying on the earth, getting in the sauna, getting in the cold shower, um, doing breath work can be a good somatic practice. Holding rocks in your hands, eating root vegetables, eating meat, even if you feel really ungrounded, meat can be very grounding and connect you back to the earth. And letting yourself just be a normal person. I think a lot of spiritual and non-dual people, there's kind of a shadow of like being the black sheep or being the special one who figured it all out and exited the matrix. And there's this hidden identity of like, I'm the special one who exited the matrix. So I can't just live a normal, boring life. I have to somehow live this very special life. And I've certainly been there, done that, played out that shadow for a long time and probably still am in various ways. But if you can just let yourself be a normal person for a while, just let yourself watch Netflix and just, eat some fast food, or it doesn't have to be fast food, but cook a meal at home. Let yourself veg out, let yourself chill, let yourself engage in mindless entertainment, let yourself go for walks, just spend time with people you love. Do whatever the things that you did as a child or a younger person before all this spiritual hypnosis got you locked into modes that you don't want. Start doing all that stuff. Think about what you loved to do as a child and do that stuff. And I think just through letting yourself be a normal person and just be a human being, that's one of the best ways to start to return to the human experience. But it can be difficult and it does take time, because honestly, I find myself still generally, I would say, more ungrounded than I would really like to be. I'm like really focused on trying to ground down and root down even more, because I spent so many years exploring intensely destabilizing and ungrounding experiences with psychedelics and then with radical non-duality that I still feel kind of dissipated, like kind of
Yeah,
like
what you mean.
I'm not all right here in a way.
Gathered.
I'm like all over the universe somehow, and I'm like trying to like bring it back here and like root it to this earth. And it's an ongoing process. So it's also important to be gentle with yourself and realize it's not going to happen all at once. It's not going to happen overnight. It's okay to take your time. You know, you can't rush your healing process, your grounding process. And the other key thing I would say is just to really just let yourself appreciate whatever stage you're at and whatever mode you happen to be in, and realize, just notice that it's not actually permanent. Even if you do feel stuck, just notice that, pay closer attention and realize that every moment is fresh and has not been seen before. Every moment is a subtly different mode, a subtly different perspective. And playing with that might be valuable for some people, or for some that maybe is a little too non-dual to go more into the, zooming in on impermanence. So
Mhm.
I think generally, yeah, just kind of ceasing, for one, also stopping whatever practices have gotten you locked into that place. So if you're meditating all the time or you're reading non-dual books all the time, stop doing that and just do, boring everyday human things for a while.
That's super helpful, and I also appreciate you being, like, vulnerable and sharing that, it's that you struggle with it too at times, and that it is an ongoing process and won't happen necessarily overnight. I wanted to go back to, because one thing that I found really helpful too is, like, when you think about, like, just going back to, like, kind of boring, mundane life, is what you were saying, where you felt like one of the greatest sort of golds of what you got out of some of those, like, presencing practices, or, like, being with what is instead of being like, what is, like, beyond all of this, to use that sort of, prompt of, like, this cup is here right now, but bringing a sense of wonder to that, and being like, this is a beautiful mystery, or maybe you won't see it as a mystery, but like that the fact of existence is incredible. Like, there's a woman who's the wife of a teacher I used to have, and she said something like, perhaps the greatest miracle of all is that there's anything here at all. And to really get into, like, a mode of, like, savoring the preciousness of the things that we call mundane, that's like, isn't, like, isn't this right here, like, magic enough that I don't need to, like, go into states that negate these things, so that you can sort of, like, come back to even seeing that, like, consensus reality is itself, like, a miracle. Like, we're all miracles because we're here. And that really helped me, I think, to get over that sense of, like, well, I'm just going back to, like, the rote, mundane, matrix world. It's like, but all of this is itself mysterious and beautiful and wondrous. And can I really savor all of these moments that non-duality will kind of tear down and say is in the way or meaningless? And maybe to kind of see that, like, people who are stuck in that perspective are really missing out on being able to get joy and meaning and beauty from all of these sort of seemingly mundane things. Even talking to somebody about the weather could be the most interesting thing ever, because it's like, how did we get to this? That this is two entities engaging and acknowledging each other's existence. And so I think, yeah, it's great to hear, like, lots of different, things that have helped other people. Um,
Can
here's
I
a good
comment on that real quick?
Yeah.
Yeah, just thanks for making that point. That's an amazing point. Totally affirm that if you look closely at anything in boring, ordinary experience, you can just start to notice that it's all astonishing. It's all miraculous that it's even here. It's all like overflowing with meaningfulness if you really like let yourself sensitize to the artistry of it and just really let yourself feel that it's actually here and it happens to look like this, and notice the detail. They say God is in the details, and just really let yourself feel the detail. And at the same time, I would say that type of practice was actually one of the most powerful for opening really deep non-dual states for me, like really sensitively going into that and just really staying with the ever shifting artistry in a very kind of like zoomed in way, like outside of the story of Jordan, just being with the raw fact of suchness, of beingness. That's kind of one of the main, that's the main practice that Peter Brown recommends, actually. He calls it the yoga of radiant presence, where you just primarily drop labels and descriptions and let yourself be seduced by the ever present lusciousness and miraculousness and suchness of being itself. And you just stay with that. So I would tell people to, just realize that if you go really deep into that type of practice, it could actually open into more like non-dual or ungrounded states. So, you have to just calibrate and pay attention to that. But you're totally right that there can also just be very everyday degrees of appreciation that don't lead to like super sensitizing or super zooming in to where you could start to lose touch with your human self. And yeah, just like life can be really enjoyable and wonderful in its ordinary human way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love that.
For adding that, and I'll add something there because that was an important point. I'll just tell a very quick story, is that I one of my first people that I was influenced by was Jeff Foster back in the day before he had come out and said that, what he'd gotten involved with was a loveless cult, which he called Neo-Advaita, and started shifting to away from self-negation to self-compassion. Um, what I had loved the most about him was that I felt like his writings had really opened me to mystery and appreciating mystery. And that was so beautiful. But I think what it's been about for me and what can help people that we're speaking about now is not to have that condition that we can only appreciate mystery when we get ourselves out of the way. So can we now reintegrate the self and the personality and, even suffering and stories? Can we now include that in the mystery? That even what's kind of called the veil is also made of mystery, so that we don't have to feel like we need to that there's a condition that has to be met in order to see the mystery, other than just being like, whoa, the fact that it's here, what? And including all the personal and the human in that rather than excluding it. So, um,
That's a great point. Suffering itself is miraculous too and astonishing. And one other quick thought on that question of if people feel stuck, like, and want to shift into a more human mode, the other thing that came up was just any amount of structure you can bring into your life can be very helpful. Structure is very grounding. Get a job if you don't have one, or find a relationship or have kids, or if none of that's available, like build things into your start using a calendar and build some kind of regular routines and practices into your calendar and start following a routine, get organized, like just reactivate more of the left brain, because I think when we go super deep into non-duality, we often become really imbalanced toward the right hemisphere. And any ways that you can reactivate the left brain, doing math problems, doing puzzles, things like that. I think the left brain tends to be much more kind of grounded in consensus human reality.
totally. I have to say my favorite is watching LOL cats, funny cat videos, highly recommended. But also, like you brought something up that I think was helpful, well, I know was helpful for me, is like starting to do more relational types of practices, whether it's, going to do like ecstatic dance, or I mean, I know a lot of people might not want to do this, but there's things like contact improv dancing, but anything that like kind of brings you into contact with like the other and then you, and there being a relationship there and embodied sort of intimacy, or maybe it's getting more massages or massaging people to like get that sense of like fleshly reality, is super helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a natural place to mention also like men's circles and women's circles. As you mentioned before, men's work is a core part of what I do, and I think that that's a very humanizing modality to sit in circle with other men and just share from the heart about what's really real and vulnerable and alive in your human experience, and be held in this field of presence and love, and then explore exercises that are about holistic mastery of
Mm.
life and very focused on the grounded elements of life as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's well said, and also one other thing I'm thinking of now is that a lot of people say is helpful is to, like, start introducing yourself to other traditions and other spiritual traditions, not necessarily to take them on, but to recognize that, no, like, this non-duality thing is not the only or the most beautiful or most true, because there's Kabbalah, there's Sufism, there's Christian mysticism. So if you're drawn to that sort of thing, to realize that a lot of these traditions embrace the self and embrace creation and participation and all of that, to kind of shake out that sense that, like, this is the only way, and then to get potentially excited about those other things and get a cat. Um,
That's a great point. Like, reconnect to your ancestral traditions if you have any, and if you don't, explore your culture's ancestral traditions because that is, whether you realize it or not, that's a huge part of the cultural operating system that was you were born into and that worked for your ancestors. And as I said before, for me, reintegrating a lot of Christianity in kind of a meta Christian way of not needing to really identify as Christian at this point, but having had many profound mystical experiences of Christ and of the love of Christ, and just reintegrating a lot of the value systems and the listening to the music and praying and some of the rituals and practices and values that I grew up in, that's also been extremely grounding for me and extremely, helpful. So, yeah, can recommend
Great.
that.
It makes me think that, I love that our conversation's just going all over the place, but it makes me think of one of the things that you also get in, at least in the non-dual teachings, that I got into, was, like, this idea that actually all mystical traditions are pointing to the same thing, and that they're all pointing to the non-existence of the self, or that everything is really consciousness, or there's no doer, and that's just not true. Like, when you get into the nuances, like, even within Hinduism and Buddhism, you get all these different strands that are saying different things. Like, some are saying the world is a real expression of whatever they're calling the ground of being. Some are saying, devotion to, like, a relational God is valid and important. Others are saying, like, we're here to participate and fully express our personalities to, be part of evolution or what have you. So that's also, I think, helpful to realize that that's kind of a misconception that, like, every spiritual path is leading to this, what they're saying. So,
Yeah, they explore wildly different modes is how I see it now. Like, some are much more focused on certain sets of modes, and some are much more focused on other sets of modes, and the only sense in which they're all pointing at the same thing is just the sense in which everything in existence is pointing at the same thing, which is just existence itself or reality itself or the mystery. And beyond that, it's like they're all exploring wildly different modes. And that I feel like is a big part of what we're being asked to evolve toward as a species, or a potential invitation for our evolution as a species, is that if we could just see, instead of playing these religions off of each other, or these different groups playing off of each other in this endless kind of us versus them of like, no, we've got the absolute truth. No, we've got the absolute truth. We need to kill those other guys because they believe something different. If we could all just start to see that all these experiential modes are valid, they're valid ways for reality to be with itself. And the diversity is really astonishing that it evolved in all these different ways across these different continents. And if we could just see that every mode is fully reality, then, I think it'd be much more easy to peacefully coexist on this planet and make the changes we need to make to avert, the potential
yeah.
catastrophes that we could be facing, given that the planet is laced with weapons of mass destruction and we're rapidly depleting our resources, etc. So, yeah.
I'll just point to one guy. His name is Jorge Ferrer, and he writes a lot about, like, spiritual exclusivism, and then this more, like, pluralistic view that there's, like, not just that there's many, what was it? Like, many many rafts, but one shore, which I think is common when you think of, like, the perennial idea that everything is pointing to your pure consciousness or whatever, to many rafts and many shores, that there's many different. It's basically what we're saying right now. But he's really cool and he writes about it. So Jorge Ferrer. Um, and I wanted to ask you because I forgot this earlier, but I think this is one of the most like poisonous and damaging pieces of like rhetoric in a lot of like non-duality and Neo-Advaita is A, don't go back, and B, you can't go back. Now that you've seen this truth, now that you've seen absolutely that there is no self and no doer, you can't go back to reality. You can only go forward. You only should go further into ego death. Like what what can you maybe say to people that are absorbing that message? I don't know if you've heard that before, but you get that everything from Buddhists in Enlightenment traditions, Shinzen Young to Tony Parsons to Jim Newman to Adyashanti that all put out that message of like, you've gone too far now, you're past the point of no return. And I think this is just so like damning. It sends a lot of people into like total crisis and like madness. And it's just so fatalist and I feel not true. So curious, maybe you could help people cut through that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Just real quick on the point about many rafts, what occurred to me at that moment was you could say many rafts, many shores, and one shore, in the sense that, like, all the fingers are pointing at the same moon in the sense that they're pointing at being, they're
Something.
pointing at reality. As far as I can see, this is reality. Reality is reality. This is this. And at the same time, each raft, each religion leads to wildly different modes or ways that being can express itself. So could be something interesting for people to play with or contemplate. But yeah, this question of like, oh, you crossed the point of no return. There's no going back from here. What has been seen cannot be unseen. You know, I would say there's a certain there's a certain truth in what has been seen cannot be unseen. I mean, you might forget about it. You might forgot that you saw it, but once you've opened to a radically wider range of modes of reality, those modes are available. Those are there and that you can explore them. But I would just say to people that it's absolutely not true that you're ever boxed in and just, you've crossed the point of no return and therefore you are confined to this narrow subset of modes for the rest of your days and there's no way you can access the modes that you were in before. It's just for me it doesn't show up that way. Maybe if you have that belief, I think that's a very strange dogma that is pretty old in the Enlightenment traditions, and I think it kind of has an aura of specialness about it. Like so many of these dogmas, it has this aura of like, oh, you'll know when you got there because it will be the point of no return and it'll just be, so clear and you'll never want to go back. And
Mm.
it's just like, no, that if you believe that, you can experience it that way. It's a valid mode you can experience, but the way it's shown up for me is just again that it's always transcend and include. Like as you explore a wider range of modes and modes that transcended your understanding of what was possible in life, the previous modes are not eliminated. They're included and they're still fully available. And you can have your cake and eat it too. You can be in touch with these, you know, this spacious juiciness of self dancing artistry. I'm deeply in touch with that type of mode, and I'm simultaneously deeply in touch with a mode of being a human being with a daughter and a wife and a life to live and, a livelihood to create and provide for my family. And
Yeah.
yeah, they can both be simultaneously there. And I think if people were more honest with themselves, they would see that they are simultaneously there anyway. Even these people who are claiming that, oh, there's no one here now, I've crossed the point of no return. It's like, Jim, I can see you right there. Yeah, like I'm not
Yeah.
blind. You're standing right
You're
there talking
the
to
one
me.
who's
Like,
saying. Yeah.
so it's a weird dogma that you're
Yeah.
just like, oh yeah, you're gone now. like gone, gone, thrice gone, never to return, different things like this. It's just like, okay, if you believed that and that was your mythology, you could probably experience it that way. And, because reality seems to be able to experience itself any which way and perspectives tend to become experiential. But yeah, that's not my experience. That's not my experience. So I can say that
Not my
strongly.
experience.
People.
A lot of people, just to say, because that's also why I love talking to you and having you on the podcast, is because you're somebody who has discovered that no, you're not past the point of no return and you can go, and it's called like going back, but I guess that's also in itself like has this like derogatory sense, but just that like no, you're not stuck, and no, it's not a problem or a failure if you decide this isn't the mode for you. And I wanted to read a quote of yours, um where you said, uh, something about like, like if you're not digging this mode, that's totally fine. See if I can find it. Basically, it's like this idea, like, yeah, you wrote like it's completely okay if you don't dig this mode, if you don't vibe with that, if that's not your natural center of gravity. It's completely okay and doesn't make you like any less awake or spiritual. And I think that's such a such like a warm-hearted and like freeing and validating message to give, that's like, so much in non-duality is like, well, of course you don't like it, that's your ego that's kicking and screaming, and so don't trust that voice, which is just so, I think, so toxic and even like abusive. It's like, don't listen to your voice, listen to my voice. That's like, no, it's valid enough just to say, this isn't serving me, it doesn't feel healthy, it doesn't feel good, or for whatever reason this isn't where I wanna be. Like, applaud yourself, and when people tell you or try to, like, shame you out of that, to, like, really, like, check in with yourself and be like, "No, there's something not right about that." So, yeah, I appreciate all of your insights, and I just
Yeah.
wanna see if you have anything you wanna say,
Mm.
and maybe ask you how much time you have. I don't know if I'm over going my limit.
I'm okay. I have quite a bit of time today, so we're good. We could go longer if you want.
We might do like a might have to break it into part 1 and 2, which is also okay.
Hmm. Yeah, I was just gonna add to that and say that spirituality is intensely personal. It's about you and your relationship with reality and your relationship with your own experience. And I feel like mature spirituality is really about realizing that no external actor is going to be able to tell you your way to relate to reality. You increasingly discover that no, I know in my heart the how what my natural flow is, my natural role, my natural center of gravity. I know what feels good for me and what feels right for me and what feels heartwarming for me. And that doesn't I can still be open to feedback and I can be open to signals and wisdom from other sources. And yet you come to a point where you increasingly trust your own heart, you trust your own resonance, and you just know like, okay, something is off about this. This isn't fully resonating, or like, yes, this is full body resonance. This is a full body yes, and I'm gonna keep going this direction. So yeah, I would encourage people to reclaim their spiritual autonomy and sovereignty and not give it away to, you know, these external actors. I mean, there have been, of course, many traditions where there was a guru tradition, and I think a lot of people have discovered very liberating things by kind of giving away their autonomy and sovereignty to a guru and going into a very bhakti, devotional type of place
Yeah.
with a guru. And I'm sure that can be a beautiful experience. So if you're really called to that and you really feel like you've met a guru figure who's truly worthy of that, I'm not going to say that no one should ever do that, but you just have to realize that we're really in the wild west now of spiritual teachers and gurus, and it's like there are no certification processes. Anybody can just, you know, start hosting meetings and start parroting the absolutish refrain of no self, and it's dangerous. And most of these people, you know, if you make them your guru and you put them on a pedestal, there's probably going to be ways in which they lead you away from your heart's deepest truth and knowing. So
Yeah.
personally, yeah, I would tell people to never never forfeit your own heart's deepest truth and knowing, even if you go into a deep kind of devotional bhakti type mode with a certain personage or something or figure, make sure it really resonates and
Yeah.
pay attention to your spidey sense because there's a lot of traps and weirdness out there.
Yeah. I That's great, and that leads me to something else I wanted to say because I thought a lot about the whole, like, you know, guru or no guru, teacher or no teacher, and I feel like it's okay to have teachers, and we often, gain a lot from other people's guidance and places that they might bring us to, but to be very cognizant of the qualities of that teacher. So I would say for sure, like if there's teachers that are telling you things like you have to keep going or you can't go back and you're going back to ignorance or whatever, that like that's a red flag that that teacher is not respecting your knowledge, your path, like you said, your heart and your soul. So that if you are going to have teachers, that they're teachers that respect your wishes, your desires without pressuring you or judging or shaming you. Other things that I think about that are important is like will admit when they're wrong and have humility and probably like we're saying, like somebody who does respect that their viewpoint is not the absolute be all end all. And, that if it's not serving somebody, then their investment should not be in, like, trapping someone into their viewpoint, so just to be careful that you get involved with healthy, respectful individuals that, like you said, like, value your sovereignty over them preaching to you what you have to do.
Yeah, well said. Well said.
Would it be okay to ask you one more question?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. It's about psychedelics. So, I've been thinking a lot about this whole sort of question of, like, how can I or sort of like, is the self real or not real? And like we were talking about direct pointers, like saying how if you're sort of primed to interpret an experience as proving that there's no self, you're much more likely to have that experience. And one of the things that's helped me kind of like deflate that line of reasoning is that, I don't really do much with psychedelics, but I have a lot of friends who do. And generally speaking, they're not going into it having absorbed all of this ideology that there is no self and that having like an ego drop experience means there's no self and that you shouldn't come back. Generally speaking, I see them wanting to have like an opening experience that maybe opens them to other dimensions of reality. And maybe they work with a facilitator who's not preparing them for, like, this is what you have to see, and these are the truths that you have to discover and will discover. They go in and they have these experiences, and a lot of my friends describe, like, they'll say, like, "Yeah, I had, like, an ego death experience or an ego drop," or "I saw myself from the outside," and all of these things that we often experience through a lot of, like, Eastern spiritual teachings or meditation. But most of them did not come back and go, "I saw the absolute truth that we don't exist and that there's no self." And I accredit some of that to the fact that they weren't prepped for that. And so it kind of can bring in like the sense that like, oh, so maybe that conviction in, there is no self, like that's one interpretation of an experience. And a lot of people can have the same experience but draw a different conclusion from it. So I found that really kind of empowering to see. So I was wondering, like, what you think about that from having had psychedelics and maybe being around other people that take psychedelics. Like, have you seen that be the case also? That like people will have those experiences, but not necessarily then say that like I temporarily went offline, but then don't come back and be like, I don't exist ever.
Yeah, interesting question. Yeah, it reminds me of uh one of my teachers on the psychedelic path, really amazing man named Remy Delon, who was actually an Orthodox Christian monk living mostly in silence for about 20 years before being mysteriously called to the psychedelic path about 12 years ago, and then spending about 7 years cumulatively doing diets and becoming really uh, incredibly accomplished ayahuasquero. And him and his wife have a center in Mexico called Cumancaya, which is a really special place to my family. My wife and I got married there actually in an ayahuasca ceremony. So, yeah, it's an incredible, incredible place, and I've brought a number of groups there to do retreats over the years. Um, just reminded me of Remy talking about. I mean, this is a guy who's drank ayahuasca like over 2,000 times, and he's had many Bufo 5-MeO DMT experiences because he's drank ayahuasca that much because he's holding space for others, and the ayahuasquero drinks to be able to go into the visionary realm where he can see into the people's system and use the song technology of the Icaro to literally like open up based on what their intention is, open up like the intention and clean out whatever needs to be cleaned through the song technology. So ayahuasca is a very mystical and fascinating phenomenon in itself. But I just remember Remy saying once, like, he's this French guy, really funny French guy. He's just like, yeah, I don't know what these people talk about when they talk about this ego death experience. He's like, I've had these full dissolution experiences many times, but I was always still there. Like a little speck of Remy was always still there in the experience, and I felt like that was really honest because a lot of people, I think, are quick to jump to the narrative that they had like a full ego death and they just weren't there at all. And I think a lot of people, if they were more honest with themselves, they could probably admit like, yeah, actually, I think there was kind of like a speck of meanness or my general ambiance was still present in the experience of how I normally some degree of how I normally experience myself was still present in that giant
Mm.
dissolution experience. And so him saying that even kind of made me realize like, oh, I've been saying that I've had these total dissolution experiences where I wasn't even there anymore.
Mhm.
But actually, if I'm get really honest, maybe I was there a little bit. Maybe there actually was like a speck or, a bit of me there in that experience. So that in itself already speaks to like how, you know, my desire to interpret the experience one way and maybe my desire to be the special person who had the full on ego death and full dissolution may have led me to see my own experiences in a way that was less honest or see them one way, whereas Remy saying that made me consider like, "Oh, maybe I was actually there a bit more than I thought." So, that in itself
Yeah.
opens up psychedelic experiences are wildly open to interpretation. I think all of life is, but psychedelic experiences are especially like, these kaleidoscopic Rorschach blots, like a Rorschach test where it's just like whatever, you're seeing yourself projected onto it. You're seeing your beliefs and your perspectives projected onto it. So I think, yeah, it's completely, I resonate with what you're saying about that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's helpful. I think it can be helpful to talk to people who've done psychedelics and have had some of those like dissolution type experiences, but didn't then feel convinced that, when the self came back, it was like this imposter that doesn't exist. And actually, the other thing I was thinking was that I had talked to somebody who did Bufo, and he said, like, I'm pretty sure I had like the ultimate non-dual experience, and I wasn't there anymore. And I was like, okay, but like, did you like, was your sense of it that you wanted to stay there forever? And he was like, "Fuck no." He's like, "It was so cool and amazing and enriching, but, like, I love being Eric. Like, I wanted to come back and, like, bring, that the insights I got from that into, being with my friends and the work that I do." And so it also is important to look at the way that you're sort of primed in a lot of these self-negating teachings and enlightenment teachings to see the self as a burden and to see it as a prison. So it's not just like that you're seeing the truth, but that like what you're experiencing is where you need to stay to be free. And so it's another way I think that it then makes it feel like when you come back to the self that like, "Oh, no, I'm back. Like, I shouldn't have come back." And that's very specific to a narrative around escape and, in my view, like a very cynical view of what it is to be a human. So, yeah, just talking to more people that have had those experiences but interpret them differently and doesn't make them necessarily feel like they have to escape reality, It's definitely, I think,
Yeah, I would
very
say that's
valuable.
mm, yeah, absolutely, and I would say that's one of the biggest traps of psychedelics is that people can have these astonishing experiences and these radically expanded states, and then they can get the idea, okay, that's what the goal is. I'm supposed to be in that type of radically expanded state all the time, and that's what I now need to spend my life chasing after, this kind of to be in a perpetual peak experience. And
Yeah.
that often leads people to just keep doing more and more and more psychedelics. And I think a lot of people in the psychedelic community these days really need to receive the message that it's okay to pump the brakes on the psychedelics. Like I over the years, I see more and more people who are, you know, doing harm to themselves and ending up in really weird, stuck in really weird kind of in between spaces or permanently kind of ungrounded psychosis like spaces because they went too far down the psychedelic rabbit hole and they didn't know when to stop and they just kept chasing more and more secret knowledge, secret information, special states, and they got sucked into that vortex, which can become, its own kind of prison and its own kind of trap. And you can easily create this false dichotomy of like, oh, these higher realms of 5D light that the psychedelics are guiding me towards so I can escape this lower earthly prison of darkness and escape the matrix once and for all kind of thing. And I think that that type of thing is doing a lot of people a lot of harm. And I think a lot of psychonauts and my younger self included, really needed the message of like, "Hey, just pump the brakes and just be a normal dude for a while. It's totally okay. Just chill out,
Yeah.
watch some Netflix, like, get a job," and
Yeah.
I never really did the job part. I haven't had a job in about 10 years. I've been an entrepreneur during that time, so that's been
Well,
another.
you're doing coaching, right?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been employed by anyone. I've been self-employed.
Right. Not like a desk job or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, not like a day job. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, what that brings my mind to, and I don't know, maybe it's a good place to end unless you have other things to go into, is like there are so many parallels for me in what you're saying about psychedelics and the non-dual spiritual sort of engagement that we're talking about in terms of like the pitfalls and getting addicted to these different states of consciousness and feeling like, you want to escape reality to only be there. And so, one of the things that you've probably noticed me writing about a little bit is like the ethics in teaching people indiscriminately, on YouTube or just cranking it out in like best selling books and workshops open to the public, that you are uh, really inducing with your pointers and what you're saying radically altered states of consciousness that are known to be destabilizing, ungrounding, whether or not they feel good or not. But it's known that in these like direct paths throughout the traditions that they are the most risky just inherently because it pulls the ground out from underneath you so extremely, can be very difficult to integrate. And I found most of the teachers that I learned from, if I kind of combed through their videos and teachings, I'd find at least a few instances where they described when they had this quote unquote awakening following what they're teaching, they went through periods of like extreme dysfunction, whether it was like not being able to work or raise kids or take care of themselves alone for a year, or losing their memories and disassociation. But they don't disclose it in the beginning, and they don't disclose it in a mature way, um, without, the pressure and judgment factor. And so I have thought a lot about like the analogy to psychedelic facilitation, where you're doing something very similar and there's so much care and caution to the safety protocol. So there is like preparation and there is an assessment so that those people are trained to know that like if somebody's in extreme depersonalization, now is probably not a great time to further destabilize, their sense of self and reality. If somebody's, has previous history of psychosis, or even if they're just in an extreme unstable place, and also to fully disclose like what can happen. So like the whole kind of consideration of set and setting that is just completely missing in sort of this new age non-dual, let's all, enter these radically different states of consciousness now with no preparation and then just leave you like stranded. that there is a real, I guess, curious if you think there's a good case for a need for that greater discretion and disclosure and disclaimers and like a reduction in just cranking this stuff out to the masses on YouTube and saying this is for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really, really good point, and I totally agree that it's very strange that these practices and teachings that used to be reserved for monks who had years of prior training and years of preparatory training, that they're just now being just dished out like,
Off the ledge.
like just this smorgasbord of all you can eat buffet of of radically destabilizing teachings. And yeah, it's tricky because on one hand, I also wouldn't want to be in a situation where information was not democratized. Like, generally, I'm a fan of free speech. I'm a fan of the internet and people being able to just spread the full library of human wisdom in, radically uninhibited ways. And I think, given the point we're at in history, as I mentioned earlier, where we do seem to be facing a number of global crises or situations that require us to kind of up level our wisdom capacity as a species, I think it's good that we open source humanity's wisdom. And at the same time, yeah, I think that a lot of casualties are taking place in that space, whether it be actual full on deaths or just a lot of the shadows and traps we've been talking about here. Nihilism, solipsism, depression, etc. And so yeah, I think that in general, the psychedelic and non-dual community could do a lot better job of making these types of messages more widespread, because I certainly had no idea what I was getting into years ago. The sales pitch for spirituality is like, it just looks like all sparkles and rainbows and the most lofty promises. And it's like, oh, okay, this is great. I found the key to life. I just need to become a hyper spiritual person and explore all these radical modalities of life. And yeah, yeah, I don't know, where were the disclaimers? Where were
Right.
And I
Now I
did hear it here and there from people over the years, like, even I remember Vinay Gupta saying, like, it was crazy that meditation and mindfulness had just been so normalized without people being at all informed that, like, if you go deep into meditation, like, it can get crazy, like, it can destabilize your whole life. And I remember hearing that years ago and being like, "Huh, I've never heard that before. That seems kinda like a weird point to make." But now, years later, I'm like, he was
Yeah.
one of the ones who was doing it right and actually saying what we should be saying, which is
Right.
spirituality is nothing to play around with. It's basically a collection of the most powerful psychotechnologies known to man for radically shifting experience, and you're literally turning yourself into a test subject and your life into an experiment. And you should realize that you're doing that and that it can go awry. It can lead to undesirable places, and so really check in with yourself and be sure that your heart's really calling you in that direction, and that you found wise teachers and space holders, facilitators who are able to hold that in a wise fashion.
Yeah, and I agree with you, like, that's why, like, I will never say, like, no one should teach this stuff because, you know, there I believe in that kind of free speech, but I also believe that people need to do it responsibly, and it's not just, like, a free for all, and also, like, first do no harm, like, I say a lot, like, if you are a doctor and you found some new radical, supposed cure for anxiety or depression or pain alleviation, and you know that there's severe side effects, and you just pass them out to people and talk about only the benefits, but don't say these are side effects to potentially expect, that's not ethical in my view. And I also think that one of the things with saying, you don't need preparation, like, who am I to say that, like, no one should do paths that they call direct paths? But if you're teaching somebody that, and also if you want to go down that path, like preparation doesn't have to mean years of meditation. It might mean having a safety plan and considering, again, like, is now the time to radically destabilize my sense of self? Like, am I about to graduate and need to be able to study and take my exams and, raise my 6-year-old daughter or whatever it is. And then also being able to, like, there's so many other things that like people tend to put in place when they do things like psychedelics, that like, what's my state of mind going into it, and maybe telling certain people that you're doing something like this and things like that, to be able to be prepared for the fallout. And that's something that I feel like is people are robbed of that opportunity when they don't know about the commonality of that type of fallout. And then you mentioned meditation, which is the other example, because now there's so much research into adverse effects of just mindfulness, like anything from dissociation to depersonalization to even things like nihilism. And, they say that it's something like, maybe 10% or so. But when you take that to a massive scale, that's a lot of people. And the fact that like simple mindfulness meditation can have such disastrous effects, like times that by like 100 when you get into like these pointers to like shatter your sense of self instantly. The fact that there's nothing really going on there in terms of, now I've heard that a lot of retreat centers for meditation are doing a bit more of like assessment and definitely disclaimers that are meant to explain to people like self-assessment. Like if you, example, like just had a bipolar episode or all these different things that research has showed can make people more susceptible to harm, that they let people know, have psychotherapists on site to support people if they're having a breakdown. So many different things that just from a perspective of just compassion and care is so missing in like this instant sort of enlightenment thing. And so, yeah, that's just something that I want to bring more awareness to and, see if it catches on in any way. But since you can't rely on teachers to tell you, it's important that these conversations happen so that at least awareness can sort of go from, person to person.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure, and I would also say too that, there's probably a lot of individual meditation teachers and teachers out there who won't be able to afford to like hire psychotherapists or put certain levels of protections in place. And so to a certain extent, spirituality, one thing I want to say is also just that life is dangerous. Life is inherently dangerous, and spirituality is dangerous. And people should be aware of that. They should be aware that it's dangerous, and they should be given the liberty to decide, it's worth it to me. I want to dive in and explore this and see what it is, because that was the type of person I was, and I don't regret the explorations that I've gone on. That was just, I needed to play that out. And yeah, I wouldn't want too much like red tape or regulations to kind of start getting in the way of people sharing their message and, teaching what they have to teach, and people having the sovereign choice to choose how they want to explore these things and what they want to engage in. But yeah, people should know that life is dangerous and spirituality is dangerous, and use your discernment.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just add to that that like for sure life is dangerous. And I think that what we're talking about are like methods and pointers and paths that I wouldn't say is just like, average spirituality, like that these are the most extreme, most advanced pathways. And that I don't think they're like in terms of red tape, I'm not sure. Like I just really feel strongly that like, for example, if you're a meditation teacher who can't afford certain things, that you can still afford to make it known to people, what might go wrong and check on maybe their, their psychological sort of background. And also one thing that I think is super important is that teachers educate themselves. Like there's a whole new movement around trauma sensitive meditation and learning, how to do it in a way that's, not as potentially damaging or harmful to people with trauma or disassociative, spiritual emergency. Cause a lot, these sort of non-dual ego dissolution pathways it's so obvious now that like they're almost like the most likely to lead somebody to what, they might call a dark night of the soul or spiritual emergency. So I think even, teachers need to be able to support people also in the fallout or direct them to support that they can get. And that's another thing that's I think needs to be there. And maybe that speaks to like in psychedelic facilitation, like the integration afterwards that I always felt like in non-duality, it was like, okay, they're shattering my sense of self, but then they're just gone. Like I have no access to them. I don't know how to live in light of this. And there was no support for that. It was just sort of like guidance to the top of the mountain and then bye, that's just not it, yeah, I think that really needs to change too. But yeah, so we've covered a lot, my friend. Have other things you want to say that would make this feel like more complete for you or
Yeah, I would say just a final message to people. If there's one thing that really comes through from this conversation, listen to your heart and feel in your own heart, your own being, what is the deepest wisdom for you? What is the deepest truth for you? And I can say that for me, when I feel into that and I have these moments of touching this unconditional love and what feels like this transcendent love that permeates reality, I just have this feeling so strongly that we're all loved and we're all home here and we can really trust the process. We can trust this reality and you are loved beyond imagination, beyond recognition, and you don't have to do anything to receive that love. You're just already loved that way. You're loved as a human being. You're loved as a child of God, a child of divinity, and you're fully free to explore the range of modes and find your own natural flow, your own natural place, and trust yourself, trust your heart, and listen to the voice within. So I love you, and thanks everybody for listening.
thank you for being here. Such valuable, valuable stuff. And is there anything you want to say to invite people to? I know that sometimes you do events and like men's coaching. Is there anything that you want people to know as an offering that we can link to?
Yeah, I would just say my website is jordanbates.life. You can find most of my stuff there. I have multiple Substack newsletters, so jordanbates.substack.com. You can look up my YouTube channel, and yeah, I have music and writings and books, many creations, so it's really quite a labyrinth. So feel welcome to explore whatever parts of the castle call to you. Yeah.
Awesome, thanks. And I'll just say, because it's something that I'm just starting up again, is a peer support group for people who are struggling with some of the things that we talked about, like coming out of Neo-Advaita and the self-negating non-duality. So I'm just starting that up again. So if anybody is interested in joining a peer support group for that meets online, please email me the glorious both and at Gmail, and we'll put all these things in the description too. But yeah, thank you so much. And I definitely envision some future conversations and maybe some musical collaborations that could be fun.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Really, it was another amazing conversation. I really appreciate everything that you're
Awesome.
doing and saying. Thank you.
You as well.